So today we are learning about culture. What is culture? What do most people think about what culture is, or what did people think culture was in the olden days? Okay, so I have a little picture of a theater type thing here. The idea is culture in its original form was perhaps more applied, and to some sense still today, to museum stuff and artifacts that you would find, or the high culture production of art, or those kinds of artistic forms, material goods or artistic forms. And anthropology takes this word at about 150 years ago or so and makes it something else. A system of knowledge, beliefs, patterns of behavior, artifacts, and institutions that are created, learned, shared, and contested by a group of people. Big, all-encompassing, right? Your whole life. It's not just material goods and artistic forms. We got beliefs, knowledge, patterns of behavior, artifacts, and institutions. That's pretty big. Created, learned, shared, and contested by a group of people. So the first part of the culture definition is simply that human life comes in patterns. We create these patterns and we live by them, these behaviors. And these patterns are going to be different according to the place and the time where we are. What you said, so it might not just be your national, might it be as simple as a neighborhood or a community that you live in, and you might find different institutions or different behaviors in a particular place or a particular time. Now, we always have to be careful here to notice that there's always going to be connection. We don't get culture from being isolated from each other. So a lot of people want to paint culture as this isolating thing that people develop because they grew up in different places. We're always talking to each other. We're always interconnected. We're always borrowing from each other. And in some ways, we could say it is that interaction and borrowing and trade and interconnection and activity that actively creates these patterns of human difference in the world. Now, you said you never thought about one part of this definition, which is you could be part of a culture that you don't even agree with or claim. Now, Guest uses the word contested here, which means that people are often arguing about the things that they share. So, for example, the meaning of a head covering or a veil, people might share that as a cultural tradition, but they might quite disagree about when and where you should wear such a head covering and who should have it and what it means. So culture is going to be often contested. Guest will later bring up the concept of human agency, which has to do with how much people are able to influence or contest or enact the culture that they are in. So the ability of humans to change, to make choices, to navigate, to be part of a culture they might disagree with, and thus try to change that culture in a specific direction. So we have this all-encompassing definition of the patterning of human life, but we should always be aware that that's part of borrowing and contestation as well. Now, where do we get culture from? Schools are important to drill culture into you, but you probably got a lot of culture before you even came to school. Basically, very important point here is that we learn culture, right? We learn culture. It is transmitted to us. It's not just given. It is in some ways given in the fact that we're going to grow up in a specific environment, but our biology is not what gives us, it's not passed down biologically, it's passed down by learning. In fact, you had a big word for this, which includes the word culture in it, but describes the process of enculturation. All right, so this is what anthropologists describe how people learn culture and how it is transmitted from generation to generation. We also learn culture, by the way, from our peers, and even children change culture and teach it back to their parents and change things all the time. So what this means, or what Guest tells us, is that we learn a particular pattern which gives us a particular way of being human. He also points out that culture comes to us very deep in human evolution. Some people would say that our styles of being bipedal, of walking, is actually a learned activity which varies. Other people might situate it more in the use of tools and other implements. But in either case, we're talking at least 3 million years ago, when people start to incorporate learned behavior into their development. So cultures can start to feel, what do they feel like?
Oh, natural.
It starts to feel natural because we learn it so early and we just absorb it, we seep it in, and we're looking at the world that way. Does that mean it's natural?
No,
Wait, what do you mean by that?
because what's natural changes depending on like the person.
Changes depending on like the person. So it can change from place to place. So what I think of as natural, and I assume it might be my mental map of the world or my norms or my beliefs or my ideas, you might have a different view of them. And then if you take somebody many miles away or many generations away, they may have a very completely different view of how things are. So it feels natural, but it changes, can change. In fact, anthropologists would probably say that culture is always changing. It's always being modified because of what we talked about, human agency and individual choices. So it's always evolving or changing. We can also go, if we don't, we can try to unlearn certain parts of our culture or upbringing. We can go to travel to a different place and try to learn another culture or another language. So this is not something that is fixed. Obviously, the younger you are when you do this, the more you might be able to seep up, but people are highly adaptable. We're highly plastic creatures in the sense that we go into different societies and we start seeping things up. I also have to remember, again, that culture is contested. So people talk about it, they debate it. Even something that is said to be natural or traditional might change over time as people examine their own lives and customs. Anthropologists sometimes use the word dynamic to describe culture. And say, again, it's changing, it's always in motion over time. This is one of the great things about culture, is that it is not ever in some way set in stone. It may be very influential, but we are not determined by our culture. We are in a dynamic relationship to it. So this is our first tool in the anthropological toolkit that Guest gives us. Last week, we just got an overview of what anthropology is and globalization. Remember, this is supposed to be a toolkit for the global age. And our first tool is culture. If you reach into your toolbox in your house, what do you think the first thing you're gonna have right on top of the toolbox? A hammer. Thank you. Yes, I believe that it's a hammer. I definitely have a hammer at the top of my toolbox because you never know when you need to go hit something with a hammer. But boy, it sure comes in handy, or you might need to pull out something that you jammed in somewhere. Actually, I have a tape measure at the top of my toolbox. Maybe it's the tape measure of all things culture. So this is our first tool that we got, a hammer or a tape measure. Our first tool is basically, it's a pretty easy tool to learn. Human life is patterned. It's not just willy-nilly, it's not just random, it's not just all a bunch of individuals going around bouncing off each other. And that those pattern differences are mostly due to the learned behavior, what we learn, socially learned behavior. There it is, the first tool. Now that you have a hammer, how happy and excited are you to get this hammer? the hammer of culture, the tape measure of culture.
When do we get the sickle?
Don't mess me up. Don't get me in trouble. You know that we're not going to put a sickle in the same toolbox as a hammer. All of a sudden, there'll be a red flag popping up, and next thing you know, they'll be throwing me in jail. Actually, I think you're way too excited about this. My claim here is that there's a little bit of a problem with the culture tool, is that everybody's got it already, right? Everybody has this idea of culture. We hear this word all the time. And so it's not necessarily a specific thing to anthropology. It's all out there in the world already. It's a very overused tool. It's like the old saying, the toddler that discovers a hammer finds that there's many things in the world that need to be pounded. So if you've ever met a little kid going around and hammering everything, it's like that with culture. People are always using it all over the place. I'm going to claim that culture was more exciting, or most exciting, or is most exciting as an anti-concept. Now, that's a weird word to use, anti-concept. It's not my word. It comes to me from one of my anthropological mentors, the Haitian American scholar Michel-Rolph Trouillot, who wrote 2 essays, one of them called Anthropology and the Savage Slot, which is perhaps his most famous essay, and the other essay called Adieu Culture, or Goodbye Culture, A New Duty Arises. Now, Trouillot was, as I said, I had the privilege of taking some classes with him, one of the smartest people I've ever met. And his idea about this is that anthropology, his first idea is that anthropology steps into this wider world at about 150 years ago, as we were talking about in the last class, into which the world had already been partitioned off into the us and the them. And anthropology was basically assigned to study the them. And that's how we got our start. So if we go back, as we talked about in the last class, or as Guest talks about in this chapter, anthropology comes to us from, say, 100, 150 years ago, around the 1870s through the 1920s or so. That's the origins of anthropology as an academic discipline. And Guest, in the first chapter, this is a time of pretty intense colonialism, and Guest says that more than ever before, during this time, Europeans encountered the incredible diversity of human cultures and appearances. Who are these people, they ask themselves? Where did they come from? Why did they appear so different from us? Now, again, notice here that anthropology emerges in Europe and in the United States as a study of who are these people? Or we might be more crude. Why are they like that? Now, before we get into the answer to this, I'd ask you, we've been talking a little bit about this, but don't forget the period that was from about 1500 to the 1870s, when many people were moved around already, ripped from their homelands, put onto boats and taken all across the world, grow coffee and cultivate sugarcane, cotton. People were displaced from their homelands in the Americas, moved onto reservations, and then moved again. And so by the time anthropologists come along in the 1870s, many of the people that anthropologists would set out to do field work had already endured some pretty brutal regimes of colonialism and were in some ways the remnants of what they once might have been. So we shouldn't forget that that's the world that anthropology was stepping into, and it had already been shaped as a hierarchy of certain people at the top, and certain people not at the top, and people made to labor for others, some people made to grow coffee and cultivate sugar, process it and ship it to other people all across the world. And so as anthropology comes into being, when it's asking these questions, where did they come from? Why are they like that? It's asking them in a world that has already been shaped by the global transformations of 300 years of global trade and interconnection. Now, let us think about this 150 years ago or so, let's say 200 years ago, just to give us a round number. What do you think most Europeans and United Statesians, what do you think their explanation of why other people were the way they were was? When I looked out the world from my perch up in Oxford and Europe and England, and I looked over the world and I wondered, why are people like that? What would I first think about why people were the way they are? Okay, yeah, we're definitely onto it. They definitely would have been like dividing the world up into the civilized and the uncivilized, or the civilized, the barbaric, and the primitive. But why? Why were they uncivilized out there? Why hadn't these people reached what they consider their same level of development? What accounted for the fact that some people were enslaved and other people were people doing the owning of things? What would be your explanation for this? Okay, good. You're on to it. When you were measuring people's skulls and trying to figure out how much you can stuff into the skull, because that's what they did. They used like pebbles or gunshot or something. They'd fill them up and count. When you were doing that, what are you trying to prove? What is that pseudoscience trying to prove? Superiority and inferiority ranked according to what were all those people doing? What were those skulls sorted into? Races. We're there. So the common European and US answer for this was that the reason why people were different from each other was because of biological race. So biological race was something that determined your aptitude, your ability to do things in the world. That's why you had all those people measuring skulls, try and figure out how big people's heads are. One of the great things about Franz Boas is he also measured skulls, but he figured out that they change from generation to generation just based on where a person grew up and the amount of food they were able to eat. But in the olden days, we thought that race was not changeable. It was something that you couldn't change, and that these ideas would basically justify the ethnocentrism, my way is right, your way is uncivilized, my religion is right, your way is wrong, you're going to hell, I'm going to heaven, right? That this would justify the global hierarchies that had been created. Now, who comes up to us here? Our buddy, Charles Darwin. Actually, by the way, when you think of Charles Darwin, what's the book that you think about? Yeah. Origin of Species. The Origin of Species is a darn good book. I would recommend reading it. It's a pretty well-written book. It's also cool because Darwin actually doesn't use the word evolution until the very end of the book. He barely uses it at all. And he talks more about descent with modification. And it's just a fun book. Has anybody read this book? The Descent of Man. This book was published after The Origin of Species. It was published actually in 1871. This book is not a good book. In this book, Darwin gets all excited about an idea that Herbert Spencer had called survival of the fittest. And he put this in there, and he basically starts to talk about man and a lot of different things about the rankings of different peoples and the rankings of women and men. I would not recommend reading this book, but you should know that it's out there. Now, interestingly, I'd never crossed these two before, but if you remember, Primitive Culture by E.B. Tylor, which gives us the first definition of culture, also came out in 1871. So there they are. Now, what did anthropologists do with this idea of the vast diversity of cultures? What did we start doing when we combine culture and Darwin together? Yeah, to varying degrees, some people, they didn't necessarily adopt this as a biological view, but to varying degrees, the vast diversity of cultures represented different stages in the evolution of human culture. So this is most famously associated with Lewis Henry Morgan and his book Ancient Society from 1877. And he gives it away in the subtitle, were researches in the lines of human progress from savagery through barbarism to civilization. So there they are. So there would be us, the civilized people, as we talked about, but then there'd be these different stages of people. Some were in barbarism, which wasn't quite as primitive as being in savagery. And the idea here is that of lineal cultural evolution. So it's like the idea that people purported that Darwin had, at least in The Descent of Man. Like I said, the Origin of Species is nicer. But this idea was that everybody's on this ascending line or path toward progress. And this applied to the biological world of evolution, but it could also apply to the social world of culture. Now, Lewis Henry Morgan himself didn't see this as a biological explanation. He saw it as a cultural explanation, but it's still not that great trying to rank people on this hierarchy or scale. Anybody heard of Lewis Henry Morgan? He did do some good work in upstate New York and around. He did some interesting stuff, but this idea perhaps was not his best. In his defense, it was probably only codifying a popular idea at the time. Now, the anthropologist Franz Boas, who most of us trace our anthropological lineage to as the founder of US academic anthropology, saw himself as fighting against these ideas of evolutionism in culture, of a ranking of societies, and instead wanted to introduce the idea of historical particularism. And basically, this was a rejection of lineal cultural evolution and an emphasis on each culture's uniqueness and their own path. And so in his view, you couldn't rank different societies. Everybody was on their own path. They were doing their own thing. They were influenced by each other, but there wasn't an ultimate goal here. And to say that one person was civilized and another was in a state of primitivity or savagery was incorrect. I will also add that this view is more what we now know, for example, human evolution and evolution in general is like. It's a more accurate view than this idea of creatures that just turn into the better and better things. Creatures are always branching off and doing their own thing and evolving separately. So it's not that gorillas somehow got stuck back there 10 million years ago and they never changed. They're also always changing and they're becoming different kinds of gorillas that we see today. They're not stuck back there in the past. We have common ancestry, and we're not going to rank ourselves against the gorillas. Now, there are two books that Guest discusses on page 46 that go with two of the most famous students of Franz Boas. He wasn't the best writer in some ways, but he recruited some of the best students and the best writers that we had perhaps ever in anthropology. One of them is Margaret Mead, perhaps the most famous anthropologist in the United States of all time. Her book, Coming of Age in Samoa, comes out in 1928 and becomes extremely popular, a best-selling anthropology book. If I were teaching this class 90 years ago, I wouldn't have to assign this book because you'd have already tried and gotten it, got a used copy of it, or got it from a bookstore and read it on your own. Because the idea was that adolescent girls in Samoa, that their attitudes toward what we today would call gender and sexuality were not determined by biology, but were part of learned behavior. And that we too could be different in the United States, that we didn't have to be so repressive, make adolescence a time of anxiety and rebellion, and we could find within our own society different ways of behaving. And so people really latched on to this. And still to this day, issues of gender and sexuality and how those are being negotiated is a hot issue. Another student of Franz Boas, Ruth Benedict, 1934, comes out with Patterns of Culture, perhaps not quite as best-selling as Coming of Age in Samoa, but a very similar message, which is that the arc of culture is not determined by our biology, but is a pattern of learned behavior. And so, as I told you earlier in this class, one of the messages from Ruth Benedict and from the 1920s and 1930s anthropology was to make the world safe for human differences. So what Boas, Mead, Benedict, other anthropologists of the time do is take this idea of culture, learn behavior, and deploy it against the whole determinism of race. And so for people who were living in a world in which the world had been explained to them by racial hierarchies and racial determinism, this was the against idea. This was the thing that people could seize upon and say, no, we are not determined by our biology or by our race or even by our physical environment. Culture, something that is dynamic and that changes, is what accounts for human difference. And if that's true, then the racist hierarchies and the ethnocentric hierarchies upon which the world had been constructed and based are wrong and should be overturned. Boas, Benedict, Mead. In Charles King's book, Gods of the Upper Air, he's not an anthropologist, but I think a political scientist. He talks about how a circle of renegade anthropologists reinvented race, sex, and gender for the 20th century. So King is celebrating these anthropologists. He includes in this book, importantly, Zora Neale Hurston's work. She was also a student of Franz Boas and talked to Benedict and Mead, became more of a novelist, never got an academic position and never got enough credit for her work until much later on. But he's celebrating these anthropologists as pioneers and renegades against the existing system. And so at a time when people are trying to do things like eugenics, like breed out bad traits, and talk about pseudo-science in a very racist misapplication of what they thought were Darwinian principles, here are these anthropologists arguing against these ideas, arguing against the idea that a feature like intelligence, for example, is racially or biologically determined, and telling us that the intelligence tests that we had were in part culturally based and people's so-called intelligence could actually change quite a bit over time depending on their educational status, wealth, those kinds of factors. So as I said, at this time, maybe we would have gotten a 10 out of 10 for culture because it was a new thing and it was being deployed against these hierarchies and racist structures of the time. It was seen as something that cool rebel people do. Now, like I said, Charles King is not an anthropologist, and in some ways he's perhaps better able to celebrate this achievement than anthropologists themselves, because what happened to anthropology in a way is that we started promoting culture a lot, right? Patterns of culture, talking about culture this, culture that, and telling everybody that we all have culture and we should talk about people in cultural terms. But the way in which people started to learn the idea of culture, they started to view it as something that you were born into and couldn't really change because it was determining your life and that it encompassed a group. And they saw culture as something that was bounded. There'd be the culture of the Balinese, for example, in Bali, And that would be different from the culture of the Chinese, which were over here in this other part. And that would be, and so there'd be this, you might say, a pool hall view of the world, as Eric Wolf has said, where everything came in these little bounded groups. Now, if you take the term culture and you start to think about it as something that doesn't change, that determines your life, and it's something that you have and can't really do much about, what does that start to sound like? Yeah.
Race?
It starts to sound like race. Yeah. And so people were like, oh, cool. We're going to use this other word instead, culture. And it became, for most people, and this is perhaps true in many ways today, culture becomes a euphemism, a nice way, when you're really just saying race. And so you might look at, and I'm not trying to say that these terms should be changed, but instead of when somebody's like uses the term European American instead, when they really just mean white people, if they mean white people, you should just say it. So I would say that some people like these words because they sound better, they sound nicer, but their views haven't really changed on the matter. So it's a word change more than it is a concept change, which is what the early anthropologists were not so much interested in word changes as they were in changing society and the way people thought about things. The other thing that happened is that culture became a way to basically ignore power differences between societies and within societies. What do I mean by that? I mean that people would just be like, oh, that's their culture. That's why they don't work as hard. And so that's why they don't have as much money, because they're all Catholic down there. And you know how Catholics are. They don't care so much about working like us Protestants, being over the top, but it's not that much different from what some people have said. So the idea is that instead of looking at a power dynamic, you would say, oh, well, they're poor because they live in one of the worst things that anthropology ever invented, a culture of poverty, right? And so you ignore the fact that there is an inequality dynamic in society. People also use the word culture to get away from the fact that people are connected to each other. And so again, like I described, you have this sort of billiard ball view of the world where you have the Chinese here and the Japanese here and the Koreans here, and they're just all in their own little spheres, and there's no connection between or among those societies. The other thing that happened is that people wanted to make culture into this very individual thing. In fact, I once got an email from somebody who wanted to talk to me about each person's individual culture and how I might be able to change or understand my individual culture, to the extent that he has to state no individual has their own culture, right? So it gets to the point that people get so excited about applying the term culture that they want to reduce it down to the individual level. So like I said, in the old days, culture was this new word which was deployed against race and against ethnocentrism in order to take a more dynamic view of the world and hopefully to change that world. But as time went on, culture became used everywhere and in some ways became, like I said, a euphemism for a polite way for something that we didn't really change our ideas that much about race and how it determines people in the world. And this is what, in some ways, was the foundation for Trouillot's second essay that I talked about, Adieu Culture, or in French, Goodbye Culture. As a Haitian anthropologist, knew French, English, and Haitian Creole, and so it was very comfortable navigating the world of the French anthropologist. But here he's saying to say goodbye to culture. So what he was claiming is because culture has become such an overused and trite word and is not doing what we want it to, we should go and use different concepts. Now, that was 25 years ago. And for a while, I was thinking that that's what I would try to do. Because in fact, culture is, you hear it all the time. It's become cliched, sort of trite, a little bit overused. But I don't think we're going to be able to say goodbye to it in the world. We still have the word around, so we might as well just try to impress upon people the importance of learned behavior. Sometimes it might just, you might not need the word culture as much as understanding how the things that we have are learned. And there are all kinds of times that people want to, how to say, they want to biologize or they want to explain difference by using things that are not culture, like gender and math.
Mhm.
What might account for the fact that there are gender differences in how people perform in school? What might we say about that? So again, we're not trying to claim that there are no biological differences between people. There's plenty, but it's probably not as great as the ways in which we expect certain people to excel or not in certain areas. And we set the world up for them so that when they do excel, we praise them and say, hey, that's great. And other people, we channel them into different forms. So it's very important to convey to people out there in the world that, yeah, this thing is learned behavior. It's still important. And so the idea that culture is something we share, but is yet contested, that's a pretty important principle for us to understand, is how people can share different values, but nevertheless be able to talk about them, fight about them, contest them. The idea of norms, a couple of you commented on this idea that cultures have written norms that we learn to follow, sometimes without even knowing it. So coming into a new place, trying to get your bearings, realizing there's cultural difference, but being able to navigate and find out, hey, I'm absorbing some of these norms, perhaps even unconsciously. I'm able to, some of them may be quite conscious, but some of them are unconscious as well. Unwritten norms, that applies to many things. Sometimes we write these norms down. What do we do with the norms? What do we make them into? Yeah, so the relationship between norms and a law is sometimes complicated, but yeah, sometimes you're like, okay, not everybody's following this norm. We thought people should follow this norm, but they're not. So we're going to make a law about it. Now, again, those things can be contested. Some people may be like, that's not a good law. I don't like that law, and I'm going to contest that law. But nevertheless, there's this relationship here between norms and laws and those kinds of things. It's also, of course, important to understand how much of our life is governed by the use of symbolic behavior and our values and the ways in which we talk about those things. Guest gives us the example of flags. Nobody cares about flags anymore, right? It's just a piece of fabric. It's just something with a few colors on it. Doesn't really mean that much. Nobody wants to put a bunch of flags behind them and hug the flag, do different things with it, right? No biggie. That's pretty big, right? Pretty big in our lives. Yeah. There's something else too that's totally socially constructed and completely symbolic, and thus we shouldn't really care about it at all. How do we know what money is worth? It's a symbol in society. It's a symbol in society. How do you know how much money you have?
Check your bank account, not usually looking in your wallet.
You're not usually looking in your wallet. I could look in my wallet and I can look at these pieces of paper that I have in there, but that really doesn't tell me how much money I have, especially in today's world. I just go around and I Venmo people or I tap little things, and all of a sudden money comes from somewhere and goes to somewhere else. So we have this completely symbolic thing, which we most of the time we don't even see it. We can't touch it. And yet it like determines how much nutrition I might get during a day. what I'm able to consume, what I'm able to do in the world, and what I'm able to drive. If I'm able to transport myself around. We have this completely socially constructed symbol of money. You said that only 10% of money is in a physical form. That's what Guest says. And the thing is, even that money that's in a physical form is just paper. It's not like that's real money. You just, if you rip it up, it's not, it's gone, right? It's just a symbol, and then it's like a symbol on top of a symbol.
Nothing.
That nothing really creates. No, it's a belief. It's a belief that we have that if I give you this symbol, whether electronically or on paper, that it's going to go somewhere else and I'll be able to do something else with it. It only functions because we all believe it. If all of a sudden I'm like, I don't believe it, and I don't take your money, then you have to go along. Now, the government tells us you have to, but let's say something happens. Government's not there, and I don't believe your money is real. I'm not going to give you a cup of coffee. All right. Important, of course, to know that culture is always changing. Something we talked about, but again, it gets lost in today's world where people want to freeze other people in time and not see that they're always changing and that people are always connected to each other. So we are always talking to each other, borrowing from each other. We do need to be careful of something. Although we are always borrowing from each other and appropriating other people's cultures, and that's a hallmark of our traditions, be careful of cultural appropriation. That is taking from someone else's traditions or culture and using it in weird ways. As Ruth Bennick said, making room for difference, but not necessarily seizing upon it in a way. And this is probably most problematic when there is a power difference in a society. When one group is, or one society is more powerful or unequal than another. So although people have used the idea of culture to not talk about power and inequality, Guest is very good in this chapter and in this whole textbook to always bring in the idea of power, or who is controlling these norms, values, and symbols, who has the capacity to put up a flag and attach it to a certain value system is a question of power.